Welcome to this recording titled SQL Server 2008 Tips and Tricks, and we will focus on SQL Server reporting services. And we're going to go down a list of new features within SSRS 2008. So we're going to start off by looking at the architecture and some of the changes that have been made to the runtime, and it is quite a few. So the reporting services team spent quite a bit of time making sure that our reporting solutions will perform a lot better compared to previous versions of reporting services. They also made sure to add a lot of new configuration options that gives us much more control over how we want to use memory, if we want to enable certain features such as the admin console, for example. And then I think what I guess most people will consider to be one of the biggest changes is that there's no dependency on IIS anymore. So in other words, you do not have to install, or actually you're not going to install IIS just in order for you to use reporting services. So we'll discuss that, and then we'll also talk about some of the configuration. We're going to look at some of the configuration files, and then we're going to look at some of the controls that have been added to 2005. So we're going to look at the TableX Control, which is a combination of a table and a matrix. So we'll talk about that, and then we're going to spend time talking about and looking at examples of some of the new gauges and indicators that are available. And this is a really nice new feature within reporting services, the fact that we can create even better looking report now because we have so many different ways of visualizing data. The ability to visualize information is crucial, because just looking at a table or a matrix or a TableX and whatnot, sometimes it can be hard to just understand what it is that we're looking at because there's just so much data. And a visual indicator like a gauge or a KPI and whatnot can communicate to an end user in a matter of seconds what it would take them hours perhaps, or at least minutes to figure out themselves by just looking at raw data. And then we're going to finish off and talk about deployment. And we're not going to talk about deployment like right-click deploy from Visual Studio or from Report Builder or Report Designer, but we're going to talk about working with scripts. So we're going to look at the RS command line utility that you can use to execute reporting services specific scripts. So that's the agenda. That's what we're going to look at in the next 60 minutes or so roughly, and I'm going to try to mix it up here and show you lots of demos as well, so you get to see some live examples of what reporting services can do. So as I mentioned already, one of the major changes to reporting services is the fact that no more is there a dependency on IIS, or Internet Information Services. And I've gotten the question a couple of times, why get rid of IIS? Well, obviously IIS is still there. It's used for a number of other things, but the reason why the reporting services team wanted to move away from IIS is because a lot of times the reporting services configuration is done by DBAs, and it might be that they don't have the skills necessary to also go in and configure IIS, or it might be that we have a very strict environment where I'm a DBA and I have no access whatsoever to the IIS boxes, and then we have to communicate to the IIS admin and they have to do setup, and they might not understand reporting services, and then it might just take a really long time before we can commit a particular change or do an installation. Another thing is, what if we don't use IIS? What if we are building our organization using a different application server / web server platform? Well, a lot of times organizations are hesitant to just install IIS just to use reporting services. Reporting services is a great tool, easy to use, great to deploy reporting solutions throughout the environment, but if we have to depend on a specific platform that we're not using, then we might go down a different route. Now there is no more dependency like that. Now IIS as well, it is designed for static and dynamic HTML pages, not report execution for very, very large reports and many concurrent users. Now there's a number of ways that we can extend the functionality of IIS using ISAPI filters, for example, or working with HTTP handlers and HTTP modules. But something that quite a few customers had issues with or challenges with was the fact that if we had large reports, it took a while for them to render, and they just wasn't performing well enough. So by eliminating the IIS removing that out of the equation, and also almost completely rewriting the rendering environment, so we have a much smarter model now for how reports are being rendered. So instead of having to wait for entire reports to be rendered, we can serve up the first page. As soon as it gets rendered, the rest of the pages continuously gets rendered in the background, and they get served up as they become available. That's why you sometimes might see when you page through a multi-page report, up in the toolbar it says page 1 of, and then question mark. That means that, well, we don't know how many pages we're going to have to deal with it. It might be 4, it might be 124 pages. So until we finished rendering all the pages, we just say question mark. Typically most users don't care if it's 4 or 10 pages in a report. They just want to start looking at the report, and then they can navigate, they can page through that report, and as the pages become available, they will be implemented. And another thing too is that memory management is easier to implement outside of IIS. It gives us more control and makes it easier for us as administrators to go in and configure the amount of memory that should be used. And then lastly, the ability to consolidate 2 services into one, so we don't have to have RPC communication between 2 separate services, IIS and the reporting services. Service is just one service that is handling all of that. So if we look at the architecture, it's looking like this, and the thing that is, I don't want to say it replaces, that would be to simplify things, but what is dealing with the HTTP request is this blue box here called HTTP Listener. So how do we actually eliminate IIS? Well, with Windows Server, I believe it was Windows Server 2003, they introduced a kernel mode driver called http.sys, and that particular driver was there to intercept all incoming HTTP requests and then have the ability to route that HTTP request to a specific application. So if we're working with IIS, for example, HTTP/sys intercepts the request and then it routes that, looking at information like URLs and port numbers and whatnot, host header names, and then has the ability to route that to IIS. With SQL Server 2005, they also leverage that. So if you ever worked with web services directly within SQL Server, so within SQL Server you have the ability to expose objects, and doing that, making them available to web service calls. Again, no dependency on IIS. Same thing, they also hook into this http.sys driver, and when you get an incoming request for a specific service that is hosted by SQL Server and has nothing to do with IIS, the driver can figure that out and properly route these requests to the proper application. And that is what's being done with reporting services as well. So http.sys, so the HTTP listener there, is what's intercepting the requests, and then we're going to have an authentication layer. So there's a number of different ways to authenticate. We could have basic authentication, anonymous access, integrated. We can use Kerberos, etc., etc. And then we have 3 core components: the report manager, the web service, and then we have background processing. The report manager and the web service, from a usability standpoint, an end user standpoint, it is the same pretty much as with Reporting Services 2005. What that means is that we have a web-based report manager user interface that we can use to manage reports and set up execution schedule, work with publishing, subscription, setting up security. And that is true if we are installing reporting services in a native mode. So with Reporting Services Service Pack 2, SQL Service Pack 2 really I should say, and with SharePoint Server 2007, we also have the ability to host the reports and manage the reports using what's called SharePoint Integrated Mode. If we use SharePoint Integrated Mode, we're not going to use the Report Manager user interface anymore. Now we still need to have reporting services installed. SharePoint does not replace the fact that reports have to be rendered, and we need to figure out, what type of format it's going to be delivered in, if it's HTML or PDF or Excel and whatnot, or an image. You can render into Word as well. That is something that is new with Reporting Services 2008. So we still need the web service, and you still need the background processing, no matter which type of install you choose. If you do a native install, or if you do a SharePoint integrated install. The web service is what we use once the report has been deployed and we actually want to access the report. So there is a number of controls that we can use if we want to use this within ASP.NET applications or custom applications. But then we can just make web service calls and extract the information that comes back, which is going to be XML or RDL to be more specific. And we could incorporate these reports into Java applications, C++ and whatnot. Now if we do that, there's not going to be any visual controls that we can use that are sort of good to go just out of the box. But we would have to parse the XML and then render that within the application. And then we have the background processing. So that's where all the heavy work is being done, with report processing, rendering, working with report processing extensions, doing scheduling and whatnot, database maintenance. If you open up Profiler and then look at what's going on inside the Reporting Services database, you'll probably see that there are quite a few store procedures that run on certain intervals to do database maintenance. So that's a high-level overview of what the Reporting Services architecture looks like. Now, something that you can also do is work with application domains. So you can see that application domain is something that if you work with .NET, you work with application domains. You might have gone through the process of constructing and creating your own application domains and then load assemblies in there. But essentially, if you want a .NET application, which Reporting Services is, it's an ASP.NET application, then you need to have an application domain. That's sort of how you manage things in memory when it comes to .NET. So an application domain is what's being used to replace IIS functionality. So we have application domain management and memory management, and again, that is something that we can configure by using configuration files. For those of you who worked with earlier versions of Reporting Services, 05 and 2000 and whatnot, you're going to see that we have similar XML files, meaning we still have a web.config file, we still have the usual suspects when it comes to Reporting Services config files, and then we have some new XML sections within these files. We have a couple of new config files as well that we are going to look at. Now, if you do have IIS installed on the same machine, that works perfectly fine as well. It is able to distinguish certain URLs So it understands, which requests to route to IIS and what requests to route to reporting services. So obviously, you're not going to be able to deploy something on localhost port 80/reports on both IIS and reporting services. Then it's going to generate an error when you try to request that, because it doesn't know, well, which one to send it to. But we could have something on localhost/my site and localhost/reports hosted on one on IIS and one hosted on reporting services, and that would work just fine. So let's go ahead and discuss configuration a little bit more in detail. And what we're going to look at is memory management, and we're going to look at how we can disable certain features. And these are two things that are really useful. Obviously, memory management is always going to be important, really, no matter what application we work with, but especially when it comes to reporting services. As I mentioned earlier on, when we looked at reporting services with 2005 and earlier versions, that was one of the challenges that a lot of customers had, was how do we manage memory, how do we get this to execute the best possible way. So we're going to look at some of the config files that we can use for that, and then also how we can disable features. So it's a great way of reducing my surface area, so just making sure that there is no loopholes, quote unquote, that can be used for hackers to get into my organization. So if I have reports and they have been deployed and there's nothing to manage really, then I can disable things such as the report manager. I might not even use the report manager. I might use scripts and whatnot to deploy and manage my reports. We can disable that. We can disable the web services. A number of really useful things that we can do. So when it comes to memory management, there is a component called the memory broker, and it's a broker, so it's going to monitor what's going on within memory, within RAM. And it also has the ability to switch from RAM to file system. So just like most applications will work where we have a page file that can be used, so if there isn't enough RAM available, we can switch to the file system. Obviously that is going to be slower, but we're not going to get into situations where we get exceptions and it just stops running because there's no more memory available. Now you have thresholds that you can configure, and I want to show them to you here in just a little bit. So you can configure these pressure changes or pressure fluctuation. So when does my server consider it being out of memory? I mean, that might depend on what type of environment you're working with. Do you have a dedicated reporting services instance? Is it being shared with a bunch of other tools? It might be that you have one server, and on that server you have SQL Server, reporting services, analysis services, SSIS, etc., SharePoint, all of that installed on one server. And then you have to be very careful and make sure that you just allocate what is absolutely necessary to each application, because otherwise it's going to go in and start stepping on toes for the other apps that are being installed. If we have a dedicated machine, then we have much more leeway, so to speak, because then really all we have to be aware of is how much memory do we need to leave to the operating system itself, and then we can work with the rest and we can dedicate all of that to reporting services itself. So there are three thresholds here that we can work with when it comes to memory management. So we have low memory pressure, medium, and high. And low memory pressure, and again these thresholds, that's what we can configure, so I'll show you that in just a bit. But what do they mean? What happens when we go from low to medium to high? Well, when we are within the low range, what's going to happen is current requests are going to continue, new requests are accepted, and background is set to a low priority. When it goes to medium pressure, current requests continue, new requests might be accepted, and memory allocations reduced for all application, and the background is going to be the largest reduction. And then when we go to high memory pressure, what's going to happen is that it is not going to accept any new requests. So you can see the difference here. With low, current request continue, new request accepted, medium, new request might be accepted. With high pressure, we're not going to accept any new requests. So where do we actually configure all this? Well, you can see that this is in one of the reporting services config files, and we have a service section there, and this is where we can specify a number of things. And the two things that I wanted to point out is what's towards the end here, where we have the memory safety margin and memory threshold. Those are the boundaries of medium pressure. So anything below that is low, and anything above that is considered to be high. And then we also have the full memory range in kilobytes available as well. So that is something that allows you to be very specific and go in and customize and change how you want to deal with your memory settings. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to show you that file in just a little bit. Before we do that, I just wanted to talk about disabling features. So the config files that you see listed here, there is one called reportserver.config. So the way you would read this is rs-reportserver.config. That's the name of the file, and then is report manager enabled is an attribute that is available. So you can see that we can enable the report manager from within there. We can enable on-demand processing, so that's disabling the web service, same file. In that file we can also specify how we want to deal with scheduled events and report delivery, so the push-pull functionality of reporting services. And we can also go in and we can modify the report builder. So that's something that we do under SQL Server Management Studio and under server properties. And then the service itself, that's from the configuration manager. That is just a background Windows NT service that is running. So let's go ahead and look at how we can work with the configuration files, how in the way that it relates to memory, and how we can work with these files the way it relates to disable and enable features. The configuration file that we are going to start looking at is the one called rs-reportserver.config, and you'll find that if you browse to wherever you have installed reporting services. So I just went with the default on this machine, so it's in program files on my machine, and Microsoft SQL Server, MSRS10.MS SQL Server, report server, and then in that root folder there is the file itself. If we open that up, you can see here that it is going to contain a lot of settings that were available in earlier versions as well. So for example, here you can see that we can specify, this is new, we can specify here how we want to access the report server web service and how we want to access the report manager. And notice here that we're specifying a URL string, which means that we are going to access the virtual directory called report server using http:// whatever the host name is, and then :80. So that is where you can go in and you can specify port numbers, URLs and whatnot that is going to be used when you want to access the report server. Same thing when we go down to the report manager, the name of the virtual directory and then the URL that we want to use for it. If we scroll down a little bit more, we can find the service section that starts right about here, and that's the one we looked at a little bit earlier on when we looked at the slides. So if you notice here, we have the memory thresholds here, the safety margin and the memory threshold. So when do we go from medium to high? So everything below 80 is considered low, 90 is considered to be high. And you can also specify that when we want to do things such as recycle a particular application domain, how long it should take to unload a particular application domain. So in this case it's 30 seconds. If it takes longer than that, then there is an issue somewhere. And then we can specify things such as unattended execution account, and if we scroll down a little bit further, this is where we can say if I want to enable certain features. So for example, is web service enabled? So let me demonstrate one of these settings. Let's take the is web service enabled. Right now you can see that it's set to true. And if we open up a web browser, we browse to that URL, there it is. There's no reports deployed yet, but you can see that we can access it. That is no problem. If I go ahead here and we change this to false, and this is case sensitive, by the way. So if we go ahead and we change that to false, there we go. So now you can see that the value, the value there is set to false. We'll save that. We'll go back and we'll simply just refresh. It's going to take not very long, and then you can see right off the bat here it's not available anymore. We get a 404. I'm going to set that to true because we're going to use this later on. So as you can see, it's XML. Obviously some people love to tool around in this particular environment. Other people would like to have a better UI for this, and there is a lot of things that we can change in the report configuration tool. So if I go up to SQL Server, we look at the configuration tool, and there we have Reporting Services Configuration Manager. We'll open that up and we connect to my local instance. You can see that the web service URL, for example, it is something that we can configure. Report Manager URL and the virtual directory is something that we can configure using this tool, and these changes will get propagated to the XML file that I just showed you. So here we can do things like the execution account, for example. I don't know if you noticed that, but in the XML file, just like here, it was empty, nothing was defined before. Another thing too that you can figure out from here, and I get this question sometimes. For example, somebody installed reporting services, I don't know what port number, I don't know what URL. In the previous versions, we could just fire up IIS and go in and figure out, well, there's the report server, and I want to access it. Since we don't have IIS to do that, you can see here that it will display the various URLs that you can use to connect to the manager or the web service just by clicking on it. And then down here we have both the SSL and the non-secure port 80, and then the default names, the report server and reports over here. So that's a little bit about the RS report server.config file. I also want to point out something here real quick in the web.config file. So we're in the same location as before, and if we go ahead and we'll open this up, we'll look at that in Notepad. You can see that since we using a pure ASP.NET environment, the way that they've added in, like how we deal with authentication, how we deal with anonymous identification, profiles and whatnot, it's just by adding HTTP modules. So that is really how they extend the core ASP.NET environment, and this is something that you can switch out if you want to. So like anything else in the .NET world that is pure .NET, it is very flexible, meaning that it's all based on this provider model where we can just add on new providers and we can change out how things behave when we want to render and work with our reporting services reports. Another thing I want to point out here is if you look in this temp directory, you can see that it points to this lengthy location here that ends with rs temp files. If we open that up, So we look at the reporting services, RS temp files. This is where, when you render reports, this is where it stores temporary compiled versions, very similar to working with the ASP.NET temp files if you've ever done that. So if you want to debug this, as you can see here, we only have like compiled assemblies and whatnot. We don't get any source code. But what you can do is you can actually change this. If you do debug equals true, we get some additional debugging information as well that we can use. Let's continue on, and the next thing that I would like to discuss is a new control called the TableX. So in previous versions of reporting services, we have had a number of different controls, but the two that we used to show tabular data was either in a table or within a matrix. And you can see a couple of examples here where we have a table and a matrix side by side, and there's different things that we could do with them. So a matrix, for example, was pretty useful when we wanted to display multi-dimensional data, so we needed to put multiple dimensions in columns and or on rows as well. The only thing is that they weren't as flexible as a lot of people would like them to be. For example, we can obviously deal with dynamic rows being added, but something that can be quite useful too is to have dynamic columns and enable that to be added, and then just have more flexibility in terms of which columns do I want to put next to each other. So if I want to put an average sale right next to total or before total, or if I want to throw in like a North America total or a Europe total, I should be able to do that without having to go through and create some really convoluted select statements or write some custom code or custom controls and whatnot. So that's why we have this new control called the TableX. So TableX, it's a combination of a table and a matrix. So we can take these two components that we see and we can transform that into a TableX control. And if you see here, we do something very similar to what I explained, where we have the ability to add pretty much whatever columns we want right next to each other. We can have dynamic columns. Notice here as well that we have the ability to deal with things like totals, for example. I'm going to go back to my previous screen here. So notice how we have accessories over here and bikes over here, and then we have the various individual components. And now when we look at this, we're wasting a lot of space over here. Compare that to what we see over here, where we have the ability to easily sum up things on the parent level. We don't waste as much white space. And also, as you can see here, as mentioned, the ability to add columns right next to each other. Let's look at a couple of different examples as well. Here we have another matrix example, where we have a current solution, something that we could develop fairly easily using Reporting Services 2005. So we have a total, helmets, locks, pumps, and whatnot. What we want is something that looks like this. So we don't want to add this total right here. We want to be able to just add accessories and bikes right away, just like we have done on the right hand side here. And then by just using indentation, specify if a certain element is a child element. So in this case, we can see that accessories is the parent element, and then helmets is going to be the child element. Let's look at another example where we have two different matrices and we want to combine the results of this. So we want to be able to look at accessories and bikes, and we want to look at sales for the 2 years, so 2001 and 2002. And then at the same time, we also want to be able to add average sale right next to it. Same as I mentioned before, we want to be able to total things up if that's what we want to do. So here you can see that we just basically combined these two matrices and we combined that into one. And again, it might seem like a trivial thing, but it was actually quite difficult to do in Reporting Services 2005, and that is much more easily done now in 2008 thanks to this new TableX control. One last example here. Again, we have some matrices. We're still looking at sales, and what we want to do is we want to look at sales, total sales for 2001, 2002, and then we want to look at a breakdown for certain regions, in this case Europe and North America. And again, we can do that just because of the flexibility of the TableX control itself. So let's go ahead and look at a demonstration of how to use the TableX control. So what I have here is a reporting services project, and as you can see, we've already queried out some data from the AdventureWorks DW database. And let's just have a quick look at the query itself. You can see here that it's just joining a bunch of data together from dimension tables and also from some of the fact tables. So if we execute that, you can see that this is the data that is being returned back to us. So the next thing that we've done is that we've just added this to a report. So right now what we have is essentially just a matrix. So we've been talking about the TableX. So if we go over here and look at the toolbox, notice here that there is nothing in here that is called a TableX. We have a table control, we have a matrix control, no TableX. What's up with that? Well, that is because we start off saying I want to work with this as a table, or I want to work with this as a matrix, meaning do we want column headers or column and row headers, and then from there we have the opportunity to go in and very easily add more columns and or rows as we see fit. And I know this is a little confusing at first, but if we go in and we look at the actual code here, so we'll say view code, and here is the RDL itself. If we scroll down here, you can see that the control, when we add it, whether we add a matrix control or a table control, in the actual RDL, it is going to say, hey, I am a TableX. That's what we have right here, and then we have the different regions within that TableX itself. But it's going to start off looking like just a matrix or a table. So if I right click here, I can do this anywhere within my initial matrix control. Notice here at the bottom half of this menu we have this TableX category, and from here we can go and choose if we want to insert columns or rows, delete things. We can add in groups, so we can group columns together. So for example, we can add a group both in columns and or rows, so we can deal with things such as a category group, for example, then a subcategory group. So I can very easily go in here and say that, hey, I want to insert a new column, and I want to do this on the right hand side, so there it is. And in here I want to do average sales, for example, so we say average sales, and then I need some type of formula here. One thing that I can do that is just a minor little thing, but that I really like, is when I highlight a cell here and I click on this little list icon, you can see that it's going to list all the available fields that I have. So I might have a calculated field already that is going to give me the average sales. In this case I don't, but instead I need to add an actual expression here. So the expression that we're going to be using is the one that we see right here. It's very straightforward. We are going to say summarize all of my fields, and the specific field that we want is sales amount, and the value of that divided by sum of order quantity dot value. So we'll take this. I don't need the equal sign because I'm going to get an equal sign right here when I right click and say expression. You can see I just paste that in here, and then we'll say okie dokie, and we'll go ahead and look at the preview, and there it is. You can see we now have average sales added in. So that gives you an idea about how you can very easily just add columns, column groups, and row groups in a matter of seconds. If you ever try to work with this in complex reports in 2005, I think that you're thoroughly going to enjoy how easy it is now when you get to do this within reporting services and the reporting services design environment that ships with 2008. Let's go ahead and do a little bit of formatting here as well. So I'm going to go back to my design tab. We'll right click here. I just want to show you that the property, the dialog boxes here, just the look and feel, have changed a little bit. So if I go in and we look at number here, we can say that I want to format that as currency. We'll do that. We'll hit preview, and now we get a nicely formatted number as well. And then I can do the same thing where I just total up all my or the average of all of the average sales for the different categories if I wanted to. Here's another report that is working with row groups and column groups. So if you see here, we have these parentheses like symbols that is displaying a group. So we have row groups. So you can see we have two row groups where we have category is the parent, and then the child is subcategory, and you can see how they belong to each other or are identified with each other by looking at the parentheses here. What that means is that it is going to dynamically expand my rows for all the categories, and then for each individual category is also going to associate any children. In this case, it's going to be subcategories. Then we also have a column group. In this case, the column group is year, because that is the only column that is going to dynamically expand. So for however many years we have, it's going to add a column for each year, and then we have one total column and one average sales column. And I can show you here, if we go in and we look at the query itself, notice here that there is no clause in here, like a where clause where we say where calendar year equals 2001, 2002, etc. It is dynamically added as new years ships along, comes along. Those years will be added to these columns as well. So if you look at a preview here, you can see that here we have the dynamic columns, then we have the expression column here with the average sales, and here we have the row groups where we have the parent, accessories, and then we have helmets and locks and pumps and whatnot. Those are my subcategories. Again, very easy to do now with 2008, and it's a TableX control. Again, we start off as either a matrix or a table, but that is just the starting template. You can think of it as that, and then we are free to go ahead and start adding columns and rows in any which way we want, and also making sure that everything is dynamic. One of my absolute favorite new features in reporting services is all of these new charts and gauges and indicators that you can add. So in previous versions, customers often had to purchase third-party components if it was chart effects and whatnot, and now with the release of 2008, they have licensed a set of charting gauges and indicator controls that you can add to your reports. So you have a couple of examples here where we can add gauges and visualize data, which I always think is super important, because I mentioned this earlier, it's often a lot easier to understand what we're looking at if we get some type of visual representation of information compared to just looking at table data or matrix data and whatnot. If we want to look at like sales results or sales quotas, how close are we to hit a particular quota? Well, if we have a gauge, for example, we can in a matter of seconds see that, well, we're in the green or we're in the red. We can look at things like page views per hour. Very nice way of illustrating that if we deal with a website, for example. Web server utilization, like memory utilization, for example, server load. We have average call time, a number of different examples here. So I want to go through a couple of examples of how you use these new indicators, and I'm also going to show you an example of how you can use some of the new charting controls. So when we deal with like line charts and bar charts and whatnot, and how you can very easily add and customize that after it's been added to your particular report. Let's start off by looking at how to work with the chart. So you can see in the toolbox here that we have a chart control, and then we also have a gauge control. So if I drag over my chart control here to this area, it's going to ask me first of all what type of chart do you want to use. And notice here that there is just a number of charts available. So we have scatter charts, range, polar, bar, line, column, etc., etc. And by the way, these are not ActiveX Control. This gets rendered as HTML and JavaScript. So not only is it going to be a lot easier to work with than trying to integrate Office web components, but it's also much nicer when you have a client base that are not all using Internet Explorer. I'm going to do a very simple example here just to show you how easy it is to work with this. I'm going to add the very first column chart type there, and notice here, by the way, how easy it is to drag this around. I can position this pretty much anywhere I want within this particular area. And then I have a data set here where we have some data. So just by clicking here in the middle of this chart, I can now go in and I can say, well, I want to have sales amount here, and I want to have year down there. And then we'll say this is going to be called sales by year. And then the axis title is going to be year. We'll do that. And we'll do a little preview. You can see that it looks kind of squished right now. So obviously we can go in here and we can maximize this so we have that anchor this entire document. We'll do a preview, and now we have a nice big looking chart. And if I want to change here, you can see that we can change the chart type. So if I start off and I don't like what I first did, I can go in and say that I want to look at a pie chart, for example. We'll do that, and now we get a breakdown per year like this instead. The pie chart is something that a lot of people want to use, and now you can see that it's tremendously easy to actually add that into a reporting services report. Now it also exposes a lot of other properties. So we have 3D effects that we can set up. We also have, if we go into the chart, you can see that we can add like new titles and legends and whatnot. We have chart properties that we can expose. So there is like tooltips, the data set we want to use, the color palette. So we want to use like semi-transparent instead. We can very easily change that. So something that I highly recommend when you start working with is just going through the various properties that we see. You can see that we have a number of things that we can do when it comes to layout, and it is just nicely exposed, and it's something that it doesn't take a very long time to figure out how to actually work with this. Typically you figure this out in a matter of minutes. So that is one way that you can work with the chart control, and I just want to show you one other example here that you can do things like this too, but we combine a bar chart or a column chart as it's called in here and a line chart. So we have a sales amount, and then we have a moving average sales as well, and we display both of that on the same chart. So you can see that it's going to be very similar to the one that I just created. The only difference is that we have this moving average sales displayed as well, and then we have the year down here, and we have the sales amount displayed as well. And if you scroll down, you can see that that is put above one of the reports that we looked at earlier on. So all of that is combined into one report. Now if I right click here, I'm in preview mode now. Notice that we have the export mode, and that in itself isn't new. But what is new is that we can also export things into Word now. So the other option, we've had that like CSV and PDF files and whatnot, and now we can also export things into a Word format that is kind of nice to have available as well. Let's continue on and look at the gauge control. So I'm going to do something similar here to what I did before. I'm just going to drag my gauge control top of my designer area, and you can see that we have a number of different gauges. We have radial gauges, we have linear gauges that you can choose from. So I'm just going to pick the default here again, and we'll add that. And if we do a preview, you can see that it's going to be set to 0 because we haven't set up a particular value that's going to be used for the needle. And if I switch back to design, you can see that if I click here in the middle, we can specify, well, what value do we want to use for radial pointer? And I can go in here and I can pick a particular field if I want to. We can also just right click here and say pointer properties, and I can actually type in a particular value here. So I'm going to say that I want my value to be 45, and then you can see here that we now get the needle, that particular value. And I can also go in here to the scale. So notice, depending on here what it is that I'm clicking on, I get the properties for that particular area. So if I click on the scale, I get the scale property. So right now it's set to 100. Let's say that I want to set that to some other random value like 78, for example. And obviously here we can go in and we can use formulas and we can use the fields that are available as well. We'll do that. Go back to properties, and now you can see that the max value has changed to 78. In addition to that, we can go in and we can add additional items if we want to. So we can get to all of the properties in one place, and then we can go in and we can add like another pointer, for example. I can go in and I can say I want to add another range. When we do that, we probably want to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so we can actually see what's going on. So now we have two needles, we have two ranges in here, and then we can go in and we can also add a label if you want to, and we can add additional gauges, more ranges depending on which one we want to use. So now you can see that this is dynamic. So just because I added more scales and I added more pointers here, we get more options that we can actually pick from. So it's a very, very flexible way of adding gauges, which is fairly popular to add, especially when you work with like operational reports, for example, and you want to use this together with the example that I showed in one of these other tips and tricks when I worked with analysis services, was the ability to add information that I extract from my dynamic management view, either from SSIS or from SQL Server, and just an awesome way of being able to display that, to visualize that to the end user by adding these types of gauges or chart controls that we see here. I mentioned this earlier, I just want to point this out again, that what we're looking at here when this is being rendered, it's not ActiveX controls, it's JavaScript, it's HTML, so you don't have to go through the various headaches associated with working with like Office web components. You don't have to go out and purchase third-party controls. The controls that we use here, if you've used Dundas before, I mentioned ChartFX. Dundas is another company that a lot of people purchase third-party controls from to use with earlier versions of reporting services. If you recognize the Dundas controls, that's actually what we're using here. So Microsoft went out and they licensed the charting technology from Dundas, and that is what's included out of the box with Reporting Services 2008. The last thing that I would like to discuss in this session about reporting services is the RS utility, or the reporting services utility, which is a really good command line tool that you can use when you want to administrate reports. For example, if you want to deploy a number of reports in a batch, or if you want to just list and get information about existing reports, then that's a great utility that allows you to interact with the report server environment without having to go through the web-based admin interface. Especially useful when you want to deal with deployment. So there's a number of different ways to deploy. Obviously we can do it from Report Manager, you can upload, you can deploy it from Report Designer, from BI Development Studio, from Report Designer, and that is real easy. And there is a number of articles and blog posts and whatnot and online resources that discuss how to do that, which is essentially just right click and then say, hey, I want to go ahead and deploy. So I'm not going to focus on that. Instead, I'm going to talk about how to work with the RS utility and just show you a simple example of how to work with the actual script itself that you use. So let's go ahead and look at a demo that discusses that. So the RS utility, again, is a command line utility. So if you look at the help, you can see that it's not a whole lot of parameters that we can apply when we work with this. You can see that we can specify an input file, so that is a script file that we want to execute, and the script files themselves are going to be using VBScript. Now they're going to have an RSS file extension, nothing to do with the RSS that you typically are used to with blogs and whatnot that you might subscribe to. These are the script files that we use for reporting services. We can also specify the server that we want to deploy things to, a username and password, the endpoint they want to use, a timeout and whatnot. And I have a simple RSS file created that should get you an idea about how to use this. So we have this demo.rss, and if we go ahead and we open that with Visual Notepad, you can see here it is. So there's the VB script. This one, what it's going to do is it's just going to list whatever items that happens to exist underneath the root of my reporting services instance. Now obviously it's not going to be a super exciting script, but it's easy to look at, it's easy to understand. There's a number of scripts available if you look at the reporting services examples that are fairly lengthy, that deal with publishing reports, for example. So if you have a batch of reports, you might have hundreds of reports that you want to deploy to an instance. It might be that you're going from a test environment to a production environment. You just want to move reports from one server to another. It's a great way of doing that using an automated process. So here is the VB script itself, and it's fairly straightforward. Create an array of items, and then we just add items based on whatever children I have underneath the root within my reporting services instance, and then we just for each through that particular collection. So the way that I would use this would be that I go into my command prompt here, and then we'll say rs-i, which is the input file. You can see I'm in the root already, so it was called demo.rss. And if I just hit enter now, I'm going to get an error message because it's going to say, well, you need to specify which server you are going to deploy this to. So we also have to say -s, and then it's HTTP localhost report server. And if we try that without the typo, we should get a result back here that should list 2 items that I have and that completed successfully. So this is something that if you haven't looked into this before and you have a large reporting services environment, definitely something that you want to take a look at, tool around with. Again, as I mentioned, there is a number of sample RSS files that ships with the reporting services examples. That ships with SQL Server. So that is something that you can play around with yourself, but all I wanted to do is just point it out, and if you haven't seen it before, now you have. That concludes this session, and just have one link here that I wanted to show you where you can get more information about how to use the RS utility, and that is from MSDN online. Great resource, and you find many more reporting services resources there as well. And something that I wanted to point out, if you have not been here yet, ISV Innovation is a really good resource if you are an ISV and you want to find more of these online recordings, and they have quite a few available there. There's more in this tips and tricks series that relates to integration services, the relational engine, and analysis services as well.